Yes, is Mr. Ashton there, please?
Okay.
Right, all right, Mr. Ashton.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. We'll carry on. Yes, Ms. Green.
Thank you, yes. Just to pick up on the point raised by the chairman just before the lunch adjournment, about what it was that prompted you to start work again and get back involved in 2013. I just want to show you an email on this. If we can go to EXO 50693 and look at page 5 of that. So what seems clear, and I'm going to come back to this in more detail a bit later, is that on the 17th of September 2013, there was a second meeting with RBKC Building Control. Do you recall that?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. And this is an email that you've written to Mr. Soons on the 18th of September, the next day, 2013. And you say, Bruce, further to yesterday's meeting, I've annotated copies of your drawings to show what I believe RBKC require in order to approve the design from a fire safety point of view. I've added the necessary fire ratings as well. And you're talking then about vents, areas of vents, and the ventilated lobbies, and what you can achieve for each lobby. So it appears to be very much in connection with the smoke ventilation system. Yeah. And we will come back to that in due course when we pick up a bit more about building control. But just while we're here, it looks there like what you've done is access drawings on a shared link and put that shared link in this email when you've annotated them and sent them back to Studio E. Is that correct?
I couldn't say without looking at the drawing, to be honest.
I see.
I mean, I just printed them and scanned them.
I see. But it looks like you're managing to use a system of communicating on a link with Studio E. Do you see that there? Because you put the link in the email, the
Right.
K:/SCA project. Do you see that?
Yes, indeed.
But do you have a memory of using that kind of link to share drawings back to Studio E?
Not a clear memory, but I mean, clearly I must have done it on this occasion.
Yeah. Okay, so picking up, we're looking now towards issue 3 of the outline fire safety strategy, which was issued in November 2013. And before I ask you about that issue specifically, I want to take you to an email chain between you and Mr. Reck of Studio E, Thomas Reck. This is a chain on the 1st and the 4th of November 2013. If we can go to that, this is at EXO 50586. And I want to pick it up on the bottom of that first page. Do you see there's an email at 17:25 on the 1st of November from Mr. Reck to you.
Right.
And he says, "Evening, Terry. Can you please confirm that the rain screen cavity fire barriers are to be 60-minute FR to match the compartmentation?" Do you see that question?
I do, yes.
And then if you go up the page to your response, where we could look up to your response, we see on the 4th of November at 9:05, you respond, "Thomas, cavity barriers need only have a 30-minute standard of fire resistance. Kind regards, Terry." Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Now, Mr. Reck's question referred to the rain screen cavity fire barriers. We can bring that up. Just go back to the bottom of page 1. Yeah. Can you please confirm that the rain screen cavity fire barriers are to be? Did you know what rain screen Mr. Reck was referring to in this email?
No, only generically as a rain screen.
So, and did you know any more than that about the rain screen at this stage?
No.
If you didn't know, wouldn't this have been a good opportunity to have asked for that detail?
I think, again, I must have assumed that some detail might be forthcoming in the not too distant future. But, I mean, the specific question was What fire resistance period do the cavity fire barriers have to have?
It's clear, isn't it, that Mr. Reck is asking for advice in relation to the cavity fire barriers?
Indeed, yes.
Did this email alert you to the fact that Studio E needed guidance on the building regulations and ADB requirements for the external wall?
Well, I think I gave him the answer, which was that the cavity barriers only need to have a 30-minute standard of fire resistance.
Did this email prompt you to think, oh, I need to address this in the outline fire safety strategy, because they're asking me questions about cavity barriers in the external wall?
It didn't lead me to think that, no.
Why? Can you explain
well, because
why?
that's a very small detail in relation to the external walls. It did sort of come out of the blue in the sense that it's not in context, it's just what fire resistance the cavity fire barriers have to have.
No, precisely. How did you, given it come out of context, as you just said, how did you feel able to provide the answer that you did without a full appreciation of the external wall works?
Because the fire resistance period of the fire barriers wouldn't change for any permutation. Rain screen is cladding. It only needs to be subdivided, or the void only needs to be subdivided by cavity barriers, not fire stops. So 30 minutes is all that's required.
Were you not curious to know what the rain screen would be and what the insulation sitting behind it would be?
Doesn't mention insulation there.
Wouldn't that be implicit in a rain screen system?
Not necessarily. You could apply a rain screen to a masonry wall with nothing else in between.
Are you saying you didn't know that the purpose of the rain screen system here was to improve the thermal performance of the building?
I'm saying just that.
You didn't know that?
I didn't know that.
How did you feel able to provide this answer without having carried out the analysis of external fire spread, which you had promised in issue 1 and issue 2 of your outline fire safety strategy?
Well, it was just an isolated question which I felt capable of answering.
But why didn't you ask for more information before giving this advice?
Because as I said earlier, the advice wouldn't have changed. The question was specifically related to the fire resistance of the cavity barriers.
What did your advice mean? I mean, if we can scroll up at the top page, with respect to load-bearing capacity, integrity and insulation. Aren't there different requirements for integrity and insulation for cavity barriers?
Yes, there would be no load-bearing capacity.
But for
they're not
integrity,
carrying a load.
for integrity and insulation, wouldn't there be different requirements? Why have you only given a single?
Well, it would be, if you look in the approved document, it tells you what criteria in each individual element of construction has to achieve, either integrity, insulation, or load-bearing capacity, insulation, etc. I'm assuming a degree of knowledge of what was in approved document B when they posed the question. But clearly they didn't know the precise answer, which is why they thought it was 60 rather than 30.
Well, no. Did you yourself look up in ADB what the precise answer was before giving this advice?
No, I knew that answer off the top of my head anyway.
Table A1 of ADB defines a performance of 30 minutes integrity and 15 minutes insulation, but by only providing a single value, your email could be read as meaning that 30 minutes was required for both.
It could be read that way, I agree.
But why weren't you careful to give the precise performance requirements set out in ADB?
I didn't think it necessary.
Because?
Well, because, if it is a 30-minute standard of fire resistance in terms of integrity, the insulation would probably have been the same.
But what was it about your involvement in this project and what you knew about what was happening that meant that you didn't think it was necessary to be giving that advice?
Well, I'm not quite sure what additional advice I should have given on this specific question.
Well, for example, why did you fail to reference the locations that the cavity barriers ought to have been fitted to comply with Section 9 of Approved Document B?
That wasn't the subject matter of the question. The question purely related to the fire resistance. He might just have been looking on the internet to find what type of cavity barriers were available and how much they were or whatever.
Were you aware at the time that approved document B recommended cavity barriers around windows in diagram 33 of
Yes,
ADB.
I was aware of that, yes.
Were you also aware that there was often some debate within the industry about the interpretation of diagram 33 and how it applied?
I wasn't aware of a debate in the industry generally about it. It could be argued, this is in the abstract if you like, that if you have cavity barriers at the junction of the floors and the compartment walls, then cavity barriers around windows are probably not necessary.
What view did you take of that?
Sorry?
What was your view?
It depends on the circumstances of the case, but it does seem to be a bit of overkill here. Not in this particular project, but generally.
But wasn't that precisely the kind of information that you ought to have been providing, either in response to this kind of request or in your outline fire safety strategy?
It's the sort of information I might have provided, having looked at detailed drawings which showed what was being built or what was proposed to be built. Then I could have made a judgment as to whether or not I felt it necessary to go back to RBKC and say, we don't think it's necessary to put cavity barriers in these locations. Do you agree? But we weren't at that stage of development, as far as I was concerned.
But Studio E obviously were, because they were asking you about the fire resistance of the cavity barriers.
But I'm sorry, that's just one question. They might have said to me, what doors to flats have to be? Do they have to be 60 minutes or 30 minutes? It's that level of question.
I see. So to summarise on this, you felt that one sentence was sufficient to advise Studio E at this time?
I could have said 30-minute standard of fire resistance, 15-minute standard of integrity. That would have made it clearer.
And you could have also said, by the way, be clear on the locations where you need these cavity barriers.
Yes, I could have said that, yes.
Yeah. Let's go to issue 3 then of your outline fire safety strategy. We find that at EXO 401107. So that exchange that you had with Mr. Reck that we just looked at concluded on the 4th of November 2013, and then on the 7th of November 2013, just 3 days later, you produce issue 3 of your outline fire safety strategy. And this final issue of that strategy was prepared less than 2 weeks after issue 2. That's right, isn't it?
Correct.
Now, we see there's the date on this page of the 7th of November. And then on the second page, if we can go to that, we can see that it was prepared by you. And this time, rather than Dr. Pearson, who reviewed issue 2, we've got Mr. McElhaney again there as he's now a senior consultant within Exova. We can see that there.
Yes, indeed.
Is that right? But he's still junior to you, isn't he?
He is, yes.
And we'll come back to the review process later. We can also see on the box on that page at the top, we've got various boxes, and it talks about reason for revision. And under issue 3, we see there it says third issue, revised to take into account comments from the design team. Is that right?
Yes, indeed.
And is it right that in the days before this was finalised, you'd had various exchanges with the Studio E design team, particularly about the fire strategy for the lower levels of the tower and at walkway level?
I believe so, yes.
Yes, for the transcript, these are at EXO 401408, and changes to the fire strategy are marked up on EXO 401501. Now, in terms of this issue, what RIBA stage was this report intended for, this issue 3?
Well, it would still be RIBA Stage D as far as I was concerned. It's just another iteration of pretty much the same report with minor modifications, but we hadn't moved on into Stage E as far as I was concerned.
So does it follow that by this stage, as with at the time of issue 2, you weren't aware that Studio E's Stage D report had been issued in August 2013?
No, because I hadn't seen it.
Now, if we can go to the introduction on page 4, we see that the refurbishment comprises, it's the familiar bullet point list, but again, we see no mention of the overcladding works, do we?
No, that's right.
And can you explain why in this issue of the fire strategy there's no mention of it?
Well, I think the explanation is things hadn't moved on from the issue of the previous report, but I accept that we should have said, added another bullet point dealing with cladding.
Yeah. And you say in the very last part of this introduction, the report is based upon discussions held with the design team, the RBKC, and on fire access and fire strategy drawings produced by Studio E. Now, unlike with issue 2, where you had set out 2 specific drawings, you don't set out here the drawings that the report was based on.
No, I don't.
Can you explain why that was?
I can't honestly say why. I mean, it may well have been self-explanatory because the report would have been appended to drawings by Studio E, but we would normally put the drawing numbers down so that there was no misunderstanding as to what we were talking about.
Yeah.
So we omitted to do it on this occasion.
Okay. Because wouldn't it be difficult for anyone to look at this report and understand what information had fed into it if you'd not identified those drawings?
Yes, it would be.
Let's go to the B4 section again first. This is on page 9, at the top of the page. And again, we see exactly the same wording as before under the B4 requirements.
Indeed.
Do you see that? Can you explain why the wording remained unchanged?
Because as far as I was concerned, or as far as Exova was concerned, nothing had changed.
And can you explain, when you're issuing this issue 3, why you hadn't made sure that you had up-to-date information about the cladding so that you could do the analysis in this report?
Well, the only explanation I can give you is the one that I've already given you, which was what we haven't been given details of these.
Did you take any steps to try and clarify the position concerning the cladding? Did you ask Studio E? Did you speak to any other members of the team?
No, I didn't.
And why was that?
I assumed, wrongly as it turned out, that they would send something to me and ask for comment in order for the thing to be progressed.
And is it right that you took no steps prior to the production of this issue of the report to ascertain whether the cladding could have an adverse effect on the building in relation to external fire?
That's true. I didn't take any steps to confirm that one way or the other.
Do you agree that the lapse of time between the various iterations of the strategy, so issue 1 in October, then issue 3 in November 13, made it all the more important for you to clarify the position about the cladding and whether it could have an adverse effect in relation to external fire spread?
No, I think I've already said that I'm to come up to be discussed on it. The gaps between I explained the gap between issue 1 and issue 2 because we were disengaged, if you like, from the design team for a considerable number of months. Issue 2 to issue 3 was just really a reflection of some changes to the layouts that we discussed with Studio E.
When you were drafting this issue 3, did you think this was likely to be a fairly final version of the strategy?
No, I didn't.
Did you look back at Exova's fee proposal, at what had been promised during stage D and E of the process?
No, I wouldn't do that as a matter of routine.
So, the
I'm
project's
just assuming it would carry on until such point as we were able to say, well, now we have the full picture.
I see. So, but in circumstances where the project's gone a bit cold in 2013, it's been picked up again.
Yeah.
You didn't have a look back at the fee proposal and remind yourself what you had committed to doing on the project?
No, I wouldn't do that routinely.
We saw, and we looked at it in detail yesterday, that a detailed fire strategy for the proposed development was promised in that proposal.
It was, yes, indeed.
So this wasn't the detailed fire strategy?
No. It certainly, for example, it doesn't contain an analysis under B4.
No, and that detailed fire strategy was said to be going to include determination of any external fire spread issues.
Indeed.
And recommendations of compartmentation.
Yep.
But we don't see that in this report.
No, I say this wasn't, as far as I was concerned, this wasn't the final report.
So when did you think you were going to be doing that?
when we got information from the design team to enable us to do that.
I see.
I mean, we weren't speaking to each other on a weekly basis. I mean, this is, we would have expected to get something from somebody in the design team to enable us to progress this strategy.
But weren't you anxious to get that part of the strategy sorted out
Anxious is
and
not
addressed?
the word that I would use in that particular context, because, as I think I've said earlier, there were other jobs that I was dealing with.
Do you think the reality is that you'd simply forgotten about the overcladding and it had just fallen off your radar?
No, I don't believe that to be the case at all.
So it was still in your mind, was it?
Well, in the back of my mind, yes.
But you didn't think to drop Studio E an email and say, guys, you are aware, aren't you? I'm going to need to know much more about the external wall.
No, I didn't think to do that.
So you did intend that an analysis of external fire spread would be carried out in a future issue of the report, as you wrote
Absolutely.
here. And what would that analysis consist of? What was in your mind at this stage?
Well, it would have dealt with all three parts of the what B4 consists of, which is the roof coverings. It might have been just a sentence saying that no changes proposed to the roof coverings. It would have dealt with the construction of the external walls, including in that section where cavity barriers would have been provided. It would have described the construction of the external walls, or in this case, the stuff that was being applied to them. And the other one would have been a reiteration that, in terms of space separation, there were no issues to consider. That's the sort of detail that we would have gone into. But before we dealt with that, we would have sat down with Studio E and looked at the drawings, and possibly with a contractor. I mean, the normal arrangement is that you have a design concept which is agreed in principle, and you then go out to tender, and the provision of cladding would be a subcontract to somebody who was an expert in the field, and you would sit down with them as well, which is why we say at stage F we sit down with the approved contractors.
I see. But you had envisaged at stage DE that you would be determining any external fire spread issues and you would be recommending compartmentation.
Absolutely.
I'm going to put this to you directly so you have the chance to respond. Would you agree that maintaining this wording without clarifying the position about the cladding and what had and hadn't been done was an abdication of your responsibilities as the designated fire strategy consultant for the project?
I wouldn't put it in those strong terms. I don't think abdication is the right word. I mean, we can only react to what we're being given to look at.
Would you agree that it demonstrated a lack of thoroughness on your part when considering fire?
I would accept that maybe we should have pursued Studio E a bit more firmly, or at all, to say, what are you doing about the external walls? So that's as far as it went.
And again, why didn't you at the very least set out clear performance requirements to comply with the B4 requirement, particularly given you say you were aware that external fire spread was an issue with the use of combustible materials?
At that stage, I didn't know they were proposing combustible materials. I wouldn't highlight that particular aspect of the design as being the most crucial.
Okay, well, we've gone over the being sent Stage C report, and
Yeah.
we have your evidence on that. Can we look at this point at I want to pick up something in your second statement at this stage. This is at EXO 401775 at paragraph 2.3. Now, this is a statement that you served recently in response to Mr. Crawford's oral evidence, and we're going to come back to this in due course when we look at what was happening in 2014 on the project.
Right.
But I just want to ask you about this paragraph. So you say there, 2.3, had Mr. Crawford suggested using Celotex, I would have raised doubts about that. At the time, I was aware that there were some facade systems which used combustible insulation materials and were still considered acceptable because the system as a whole was tested or assessed under BS 8414 and found to comply with BR 135, or was accepted as an engineered solution. However, where the linear route to compliance under ADB was followed, it required an insulation to be non-combustible or of limited combustibility, and I was not aware of any Celotex products that would meet that requirement. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
Now, as I say, we'll come back to this and look at this statement in more detail, but for now I want to ask you, if you knew that there were these two routes to compliance, the linear route within ADB and the whole system test under 8414 and BR135, why didn't you spell that out in the B4 section of your fire strategies?
But I think it comes back to what the answer that I gave you before to why didn't you include the performance specification in your strategy. We don't, as a matter of course, put in performance requirements in every clause of every report.
I appreciate that. You'd need to have something to think that it was going to be relevant, but
Yeah.
you did know there was going to be overcladding. You had no reason to think that the overcladding had somehow fallen away. Why didn't you flag, for example, the need for the insulation to be of limited combustibility if following ADB?
Because at that stage I didn't know which route they were thinking of pursuing.
And why didn't you think to ask?
Well, it goes back to why didn't I speak to them at all about the issue? I would have expected them to speak to me first, to tell me what their proposals were, to enable me to make a judgment and to advise them accordingly.
Yeah. Was that not something, again, that you were keen to know which route to compliance they were going to be following? Because that obviously then potentially would affect how you analyse the external wall.
No, I think the two routes, if you like to call them that, are reasonably self-explanatory. If you want to use what you call a linear route, that means you have to use materials which satisfy the criteria in approved document B. If you want to go another way, then that requires a lot more effort. You need to get it tested if it hasn't already been tested, or you need to get it assessed based on a test that has been done on a similar setup, and it's quite a lengthy process. But we didn't have any of that discussion with them because they didn't raise the question with me.
No, but given that route could be a lengthy process and potentially an expensive one, that's right, isn't it? If you're going to go down that route.
I don't know whether it's more expensive than going the linear route, as they call it,
Okay.
because I don't believe that those systems that have been tested are more expensive. The cost of those tests has been borne by the manufacturers.
Sorry, I thought for a moment you were saying that one possibility was that there was a bespoke test in relation to these materials.
No, the tests are defined in BS 8414 and BR 135. So if you don't want to use materials which already satisfy approved document B, you have to get them tested or assessed.
Yeah. Okay. What did you understand at this stage? It's a slightly different topic, but still relevant to the external wall. What did you understand at this stage about what would be at the very top of the building, at the head of the cladding system?
I had no idea. I'd never seen any drawings.
Did you know that there was to be a crown structure at the top of the building?
No, I didn't.
Were you ever made aware that there was a crown structure at the top of the building?
No.
And so you were never asked to advise on that aspect?
No.
On to the B3 requirement. So looking at this on page 8, this is back to the outline fire safety strategy issue 3. That's EXO 40, thank you.
Right.
Yeah, so this is what was said here about the B3 requirement. So again, scanning down this, we can see there's no reference here to approved document B in section 9 or paragraph 12.8 about the requirement for cavity barriers, is there?
No. This is headed compartmentation.
And when you were writing this bit of your report or finalising it, did you not have in mind that Studio E had just a few days before consulted you about the cavity barrier requirements and clearly did need guidance in this area?
All that it asked me, and I think we've just been through this, was that they needed to know the fire resistance of cavity barriers. Was it 60 minutes or was it something else?
Yeah. If we look back, with B3 still in mind, I just want to look back at page 4 of the report,
Right.
where you set out the introduction and what the refurbishment would comprise. Do you see the last bullet? You've got generally improvements to the building services. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Were you aware at this time that the refurbishment works would involve key changes to the lobbies on all floors of the building?
I knew that they were going to put in a smoke extract, a mechanical smoke extract system, if that's what you're asking.
What about new risers, water pipes for the heating and for the cold water system?
No.
You didn't know that?
Well, I knew there were improvements to the services, but whether they were relevant to the fire safety strategy or not was a questionable.
Well, again, why didn't you ask? Why didn't you find out whether they might be relevant?
Well, I just didn't.
Because what you don't explain what those works were, and
No, this is just a general introduction to what the refurbishment comprised. It didn't go into minute detail as to what was going on.
No, I understand, but with reference to compartmentation, why do you not consider the impact on compartmentation of these general improvements to the building services, such as the heating and the cold water?
I didn't think they were significant.
What gave you that impression?
Well, they're not. They don't introduce major breaches in compartmentation. In a block of apartments, they could only be run in the common area and then feed off into the various apartments, cold water and the like. And then that would have to be fire stopped at some point. But that would have been in a specification which I'd not seen.
I see. Because you don't consider, for example, the impact of the cupboard in the lobbies, which would house the new risers, and the impact of that in terms of compartmentation, do you?
No, but it was an existing cupboard, I believe.
But you wouldn't think to check whether the imposition of new pipework, new risers, might have affected the building's compartmentation on all the lobbies?
No, because it wasn't a particularly significant alteration to the building as far as I was concerned.
Okay. Looking then at B1, means of warning and escape, I just want you to look briefly at this. If we go to page 7, we can see in the middle of the page, under the heading Smoke Ventilation of Lobbies, you've included a note which said this. It said, this supply and extract system will be overhauled as part of the improvement to the building services. This is covered in a separate report by Max Fordham. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
So in this third issue of your report, you've left the design of the lobby smoke control system to Max Fordham to address. Is that correct?
It was their duty, if that's the right word, from day one. It was part of their brief.
But you didn't think that you ought to set out in this fire strategy for the refurbishment for the building any performance requirements for the new smoke control system?
I think I've answered this question earlier. The performance requirements for smoke ventilation systems serving a common lobby are well known in the industry. Certainly would have been well known to Max Fordham, which is that the objective is to prevent spread of smoke into the stair, so it can be used by other occupants of the building and the fire service. I didn't see the need to spell that out in this place.
Would you agree with me that those performance criteria fell into two categories? First of all, the performance criteria for the smoke control system itself, and secondly, the performance criteria for the fire and smoke dampers as well?
But that's just a detail. What you would need to do would be to approve the concept initially, and you would then talk about, when you're designing a smoke extract system which is only designed to extract smoke on one floor, you have a series of dampers. The one on the fire floor opens and the others remain closed, but that would be an integral part of the design of the system, which was being done by others.
I see. So because it was being done by others, you didn't look at the potential impact, for example, of on compartmentation, of having these shafts rising through the building, and whether the dampers were adequately rated. or not?
No, I would see that as part of the design of the system. But I mean, we weren't introducing, or they weren't introducing further openings in the compartmentation. Those openings already existed. The vertical shafts were already there.
Yes, they were.
Yeah.
Do you accept that the fire strategy should have at least made clear the role of the system, the performance requirements it should have met, and how that system contributed to life safety in the building?
I could have done that, but I didn't think it was necessary to go into that level of detail.
Do you agree that in a building which featured a single stair, which served flats and non-residential demise, the smoke control to the stair was a fundamental cornerstone of the fire strategy for residents and for firefighters, which should have been addressed in your reports?
I'm not sure I would agree that it's certainly an important feature of it, but given that there was one there already and it was being improved, I don't really see why I needed to go into any more detail in this report.
Okay. Now you go on in this B1 section, we could keep this bit up on the screen here. You go on to indicate that for the walkway, mezzanine and ground story levels, there's a blue heading there for that the lobby to the boxing club and the community room should have automatic opening vents of 0.4 metre squared in area. Do you see that?
I do,
in the
yes.
second line?
Yeah.
Do you agree that this advice was contrary to the guidance given in ADB 2013 because the size of the opening vents were not compliant with the relevant British standard, that's BS 55885 2004, which required vents of more like a metre squared in area?
I accept that, but I mean, that was the best that we could achieve.
But again, isn't it about, did it not occur to you to highlight that it wasn't compliant with that guidance, but then explain why that was the best that could be achieved and why that was nevertheless acceptable for this building?
Well, we discussed it with the local authority and they appeared to be happy with that as being the best that could be achieved.
Why didn't you draw attention to this non-compliance in your strategy and explain why you were recommending a departure from that guidance?
Well, the guidance in relation to smoke ventilation of firefighting shafts in residential buildings, it relates to a fire in a residential apartment, and the code asks for vents larger than this to deal with a domestic fire, which is sometimes a lot more severe than a fire in an area such as a boxing club or an office. But all right, maybe there should have been some more detail in there, but it's a statement of what we were doing there, and it was accepted by the local authority.
Okay. Stair width. I just want to ask you about stair width and this third issue.
Right.
If we go in the B1 section back to page 6, and there you've dealt with various aspects of means of escape.
Right.
I think it's right that nowhere there do you ever state that the stair width of 1,040 millimetres was 60 millimetres less than the current design guidance ADB would have required, which is 1,100 millimetres.
No, it's an existing stair.
But again, wasn't that a non-compliance with the current statutory guidance that you should have referred to expressly and then said you've taken into account nevertheless when you're drafting the fire strategy?
I'm not sure that we would start all of our fire strategies with a list of the ways in which a building doesn't comply with current standards. I mean, if you're seriously suggesting that we should recommend it to the client that he increase the width of that stair to the code compliant width, that's just not practicable.
No, I'm not suggesting that, nor am I suggesting that you do list out all the areas of non-compliance at the beginning of the report.
So
But
why are you picking on this particular aspect?
Well, because the stairs were narrower than current design guidance would recommend, and wasn't that a point that could be made? And and then explained why it would clearly not be practical to widen them, but to show that you've taken into account when you've balanced all the other measures. Isn't that exactly what a fire strategy is?
It conceivably might have added something to the narrative, but not a lot, I don't believe. I mean, what should we have said? The stair is actually less than 1100 millimetres, but we don't consider that to be a major factor in fire safety in this building.
Yes, for the following reasons. Because
Well, I can't give you any reasons why it wouldn't be any better, because it was an existing stair. And in terms of its capacity to evacuate the building, it was perfectly adequate.
Could that not have affected, for example, the performance of the smoke control system and how...
No, that wouldn't have had any bearing on
how good you would want that to be?
Sorry?
How good you would want it to be?
No, because the stair, as I said earlier, the smoke extract system is designed to stop smoke getting into the stair, not compensate for its lack of width.
So, do you agree that there's no requirements specified anywhere here in this report for the responsible person regarding mobility impaired persons?
Well, that's a difficult one. I'm not saying it's a difficult question for me. There are no requirements to put in place provisions for facilities for disabled persons in residential buildings. They are excluded from the requirements for other buildings. Simply, I think, on the basis that you can't manage it in this type of building, and that persons with disabilities, if they're not in the fire-affected apartment, are perfectly safe to stay where they are.
Does that mean that in the preparation of these reports, you didn't consider the means of escape for those with disabilities?
No, but the law didn't require us to.
At this time, were you aware that approved document B requires consideration of means of escape from those with a disability?
I think that was a general statement in the approved document, but it didn't apply specifically to apartment blocks because there are no provisions for apartment blocks in the guidance.
Can we just go to that? It's at CLG 50224 at page 13, and it's 0.19 of ADB.
Right.
And it's there at the bottom and on the left. If we can zoom in on the bottom half of the page, inclusive design 0.19. We looked at this 2 days ago with Miss Barker. Were you aware that this section draws attention to Part M of the building regulations, access to and use of buildings, which requires reasonable provision for access by people to buildings? Were you aware of that?
Yes, I'm aware of the general cross-reference.
And were you aware that it said people, regardless of disability, age or gender, should be able to gain access to buildings and use their facilities, both as visitors and as people who live or work in them?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And then this, as such, the fire safety measures incorporated into a building will need to take account of the needs of all those persons who may have access to the building. It is not appropriate, except in exceptional circumstances, to presume that certain groups of people will be excluded from a building because of its use.
I absolutely agree with that sentiment, but I go back to the point I made that there are no recommendations in the documentation issued by government departments or others as to what you do about means of escape for disabled persons in residential buildings. You might say, well, there should be,
yeah.
But the fact is there are not.
I appreciate that within the rest of ADB, you don't have a specific recommendation that you ought to have this fire performance because of the need to accommodate X people or the need to have a refuge here or whatever. But isn't this signalling to you, you've still got to take into account the needs of those persons when you're putting, for example, your fire strategy together?
Generally, for a new residential building, we would say under means of escape for disabled persons, there are no requirements. You're not required to provide facilities for them to escape.
Does that mean then you just don't think about it anymore?
Well, exactly.
Can we look also at page 17 in the right column? Under criteria for means of escape, that's halfway down that page, can you see there's a note? So it says some people, for example, those who use wheelchairs, may not be able to use stairways without assistance. For them, evacuation involving the use of refuges on escape routes and either assistance down or up stairways or the use of suitable lifts will be necessary. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
And again, did you have that in mind when you were working on the Grenfell project?
Not at all. I think the important point is that you do not provide refuges in stairs in residential buildings, and you don't have management arrangements to evacuate disabled persons, because frequently and quite often there are no management facilities on site. You might think that's a bad thing, but that's not a decision taken by fire consultants. That's a decision taken by the government.
Does it follow then, therefore, that there was no consideration given to the type of people living in the building when constructing the fire safety strategy, with particular regard to approved document M?
Yes, you could say that. I mean, approved document M is outside the scope of fire. For a new building, you would obviously have to consider that the building provides access for people with disabilities.
Did you ever ask for any information arising out of, say, consultations with residents or other information about who was living in the building to be provided to you?
No, I didn't.
You didn't ever ask the TMO about that?
No, I didn't, no.
And did you ever give consideration to the types of people likely to be living in high-rise residential buildings in terms of needs?
No, it isn't something that a fire consultant would necessarily do.
At this time, were you aware that Exova had provided the outlined fire strategy for the Kensington Academy and Leisure Centre project, which did refer to disabled evacuation under that heading, a heading called disabled evacuation? Were you aware of that?
Probably, because I think I reviewed or helped my colleague dealing with that. But
and why would it have been considered for that project but not for this one?
Because the law requires that it is in the other building.
Did you never consider, for example, refuges for the non-residential accommodation below level 4?
They were already there.
Those refuges, were they?
No. The non-residential elements were already there, albeit in a slightly different configuration.
But did you ever consider refuges in relation to that?
No. I mean, had I done so, I would have soon realised that there wouldn't be a management regime in that building who were able to evacuate people with disabilities.
I see. Do you also agree that nowhere in your reports is there an acknowledgement of the mixed-use nature of the building, and so the potential for there being multiple responsible persons, some more in control than others?
No.
That wasn't something
No,
you
it
addressed?
wasn't something I considered. I mean, bear in mind that the uses were fairly low-key. You had a boxing club with 2 adults and a few young children. You had a sort of office-type accommodation, which was very low occupancy. You had a community room for use of the occupants of the building. I didn't see that there needed to be a great deal of more detail provided.
Wouldn't it, given that you might have had multiple responsible persons, wouldn't that potentially present challenges in terms of communication and coordination, which ought to have been addressed in your report?
No, I think that would be more in the fire safety management plan of the sort to satisfy the regulatory reform order. We can't really dictate how a building is run when we're doing a fire strategy. We can say that there are certain aspects of the design of this building which do require to be managed, but that's about as far as we can go.
Mr. Chairman, I think I might call for a break in a moment, but I'm going to ask one more question before I do, and then we're going on to a bigger topic.
So that would be a good point.
Yeah.
Yes, all right.
So this is just picking up on something you said yesterday. So we established that you don't have formal fire engineering qualifications, and Ms. Barker said something similar. Did Exova have a policy of putting unqualified personnel onto this job, given that 90% of their people, you said, were qualified in fire engineering? Was there a deliberate decision that this job could justify having people without the fire engineering qualifications?
Yes, I believe it could. I mean, when you say unqualified, I mean...
I beg your pardon, not having a formal fire engineering qualification.
Whilst having a formal fire engineering qualification is desirable for everybody doing fire engineering, it's not absolutely essential for a building where they're proposing fairly modest changes to the layout, and you have an individual who has dealt with hundreds of buildings like that.
I see. But back to my question, do you think there was something about this project which meant that it wasn't considered necessary to have people with formal fire engineering qualifications on it?
No, I think you can't just say that it has to be somebody with fire engineering qualifications. You have to have regard to experience as well. Somebody who's just got a fire engineering degree and has come out of a college may not be the appropriate person to look at a difficult building in terms of getting the means of escape sorted out properly.
And was cladding at all in
Cladding
your
wasn't...
mind?
I don't think cladding played any part in the decision as to who ran the job. I mean, but you also have to accept that when a job comes into a particular office, there will be a finite number of people who can work on it, and it may be that there aren't people with fire engineering qualifications with enough capacity to deal with this particular job. But I really don't think that it was necessary for a qualified fire engineer to work on this project.
Okay.
That implies that somebody who isn't good enough to do the job, and I believe that to be wrong.
Yeah, understood. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, that would be...
Is that a good point?
At the moment. It is, yeah.
All right. Well, we'll say we're going to have a short break now.
Okay.
Mr. Ashton, I'm going to say 3:10, and usual instruction, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence when they're out of the room.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right, 3:10,
Yeah.
please. Yes, thank you. Could you ask Mr. Ashton to come back, please? All right, Mr. Ashton.
Yes, thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Thank you. Yes, I've just got one follow-up question on that topic that we were looking at in terms of the disabled and mobility impaired persons.
Yeah.
Was it normal to have such a passive client as the TMO in terms of passing you information about the residents in the building? Would you normally expect to be provided with more information about?
No, I wouldn't describe TMO as passive, but we wouldn't be passed that sort of information unless there were reasons for us to consider it. For example, if there was a building that was purpose-built for people with disabilities, but we would treat Grenfell Tower as the same as any other block of apartments.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so I want to move now to a slightly different topic, which is about the review process and quality control within Exova.
Okay.
And that's before we come on. After that, we're going to discuss some further ad hoc advice, which you gave after November 2013 on the project. Now, to whom, if anyone, in Exova did you report to in respect of the Grenfell project?
I didn't report to anybody in that sense. I mean, I was the manager of the London office, and the buck stopped with me, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. So does that mean, was there anybody at Exova responsible for overseeing your work on the project?
Oh, yes, the director of the company would have overseen my work in that sense, yes.
Who would that be?
Mr. David Harris.
And did he do that on this project?
No, he wouldn't routinely do it on projects. You know, it would just maybe a spot check now and then.
Yeah. Because it appears from the documents, and correct me if I'm wrong, that essentially you were working on this project on your own for large parts of it. Is that right?
That will be true of a number of projects that we work on, given the resources that we have.
Was there any chartered professional for Exova working on the project with you?
Tony
Pearson.
Tony Pearson was chartered.
So
James
where we
Lee,
see-
I think, was working towards being chartered.
And was anybody your formal line manager within Exova?
Well, my former line manager was David Harris,
Yeah.
the general manager of the division.
And at the time you were working on the Grenfell project, were you aware whether or not Exova was certified under British Standards Institute publication ISO 9001 on quality management systems?
We weren't certified at that point, but we were working towards getting certification, and we are now certified.
And when did Exova get that
I
9001?
couldn't give you a precise date, but it was certainly after we were working on Grenfell.
I see. What I want to do now is look at the quality control procedure that Exova followed in relation to two different aspects of the work. The first in relation to the fire safety strategy reports,
Right.
and the second with regard to technical emails. Okay, we'll look at
Okay.
those two things. And looking first at fire safety strategy reports, can we look at an internal Exova document entitled Overall Procedure Review? We find this at EXO 401209. Now, looking at the top of this, it's called Overall Procedure Review. It's said to be issue 2, which is dated the 18th of December 2014. Do you see that?
Yes, indeed.
And it's to be reviewed in 2018. So this comes towards the end of your time on the Grenfell project.
Right.
But I just want to ask you about whether some of these operating procedures were familiar to you at the time you were working on the Grenfell project. in
Yes, they
terms of-
were.
Yeah.
Yes.
So let's look in the introduction at item 2. It says that operating procedures are issued to assist staff in ensuring that the requirements of the relevant standards are followed correctly in the relevant division. If there is any conflict between this operating procedure and the relevant standard, the requirements of the standard take precedence. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then if we go on to page 3, at paragraph 8, yeah, there we have a section called main project phase.
Right.
And at the bottom of the page, in the first paragraph, it states, so the first paragraph there, it says, Exova undertakes a diverse range of project types. The most appropriate main phase procedure should be selected from the following list. If no clear match is found, the general main phase procedure should be adopted, which requires a specific project plan to be developed. And then it says each procedure can be supplemented by, and then it says those things. And a number of items are listed there. And if you look down the bullets, 5 bullets down, there's a black heading in bold, guidelines which provide advice and background information on how to approach specific projects. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Now, in the light of that, were there any guidelines that you followed when drafting the fire safety strategies for the Grenfell project?
No, there were guidelines, but I didn't religiously follow those guidelines. I just followed the procedure which I adopted on numerous previous projects.
When you say there were guidelines, does that mean there were guidelines which were specific to how to prepare fire safety strategy reports?
No, not specifically. I mean, bear in mind that these things were produced in, the early part of the 20th century. In the 2000s. But custom and practice before that had been to follow agreed procedures as to how you composed reports. And all reports were reviewed to ensure that those general guidelines were followed.
But why did you feel that you didn't need to follow the guidelines and you could just follow what you'd always done?
Well, the structure of the reports that I produced on Grenfell was the same as the structure of reports on numerous other projects.
Now, on page 4, if we go on to page 4, at paragraph 9, there's a heading project closure. Do you see that there?
Yes, indeed, yeah.
And it says Exova procedure, and then a number of letters and numbers are given for a procedure, describes the project closure process, which requires, do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then we've got a number of bullets, including a check that all elements of the project have been completed satisfactorily, a check that all time and other costs have been posted via the timesheet, etc., a check that the project's been fully invoiced, all relevant electronic files to be placed in the correct folders, all hard copies of the files to be appropriately filed. Do you see that there?
Yes, indeed.
Now, were you aware that there were project closure processes when you were working on the Grenfell project?
Yes, there were. I was aware of those procedures, yeah.
And did you follow those procedures?
No, because as far as I was concerned, the project didn't finish in the normal way.
Did you ever do a check that all elements of the project had been completed satisfactorily?
No. I mean, as I said in response to earlier questions, at the time of producing the last fire strategy report, I was still awaiting details of the external enclosures for me to examine and report on, and that never happened.
I appreciate that. Let's think forward at any stage in the project for a moment.
Right.
So I appreciate we'd stopped at issue 3 for the moment, but we'll look at the other pieces of email advice you gave over 2014, 2015, etc. But
Right.
at any stage thereafter, did you follow this project closure procedure and check that all elements of the project had been completed satisfactorily?
No, I didn't do that check.
And again, why would that be?
Because, as I say, I don't believe that that the project followed the normal progression of other projects. I did say earlier in my statement, I think, that sometimes we would work and do a proportion of the proposal that was contained in our fee proposal, and then we might not proceed for some reason. Either the project came to a halt or they chose somebody else.
Did it ever occur to you to do a check and, if necessary, get back in contact with the design team or the client and say, look, we've done this, seems to have run into the sand, but is there any more we should be doing? Did you ever think to do that?
No, I didn't think to do that. I thought it would come the other way, if I'm honest.
Okay. Let's look at another internal document, Exova document, entitled Project Completion Procedure. This can be found at EXO 401224. And this one is said to have become effective if we look at that top set of boxes. Issue date 1st of April 2010.
Right.
And the review date was the 1st of April 2012. Do you know if there was a review of this internal document after 2012?
Do you mean the procedure document?
Yeah, so it's issued and it looks like it's supposed to be reviewed after 2 years, and then as we saw with the other document, you then maybe get an issue 2. Do you know what happened with any issue after this?
No, I don't.
Were you aware of this project completion procedure in 2010 and through to 2012?
Oh, yes.
Did you ever follow it?
On some projects, yes, but not on everyone, I must be honest. You have to accept that there are other priorities, that, you know, you're actually dealing with live jobs. I mean, okay, the ISO 9001 standards are, if you like, a council of perfection. At that time, we weren't certified to ISO 9001. I think that there were procedures that weren't necessarily followed to the letter.
Yeah. If we look in page 1 at section 4, we can look down at that. So this deals with closure of the project. If we can read that first paragraph. For many projects, the exact point at which the consultancy work has been completed is not always immediately evident. The project manager should make careful note of the scope of services provided in the contract documentation. This would initially be the fee proposal which provided and the details confirmed on the fee acceptance form. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
And was a careful note taken of the scope of services provided?
But by myself?
Yeah.
Well, I understood what we were going to be doing because I wrote the fee proposal.
It then goes on to say Appendix A shows the flow chart, and it says, to ensure a high standard is maintained, the project manager is required to check that all elements of the project to have been completed satisfactorily. This will entail a review of the scope of services set out in the fee proposal and a specific review of the documents stored on the electronic filing system to determine that the scope of services have been completed. Now, pausing there, would the project manager have been you for the Grenfell project?
It would have been, yes.
And I think we've asked this, but I'm going to ask it again. In accordance with this procedure, did you ever check that all elements of the project had been completed satisfactorily at any stage?
No, I didn't. There was an expectation that there would be further work coming on the project.
And then we see that or there, after that first bullet, says or contact the client or client's representatives to ensure that they are satisfied that the scope of services match with their expectations. Any comments from the client should be stored on the electronic filing system in the correspondence folder. So again, that was the alternative I was talking about earlier.
Yes.
Did it ever occur to you to do that, to contact the client?
No.
To check? I now want to look at the quality control of strategy, of the fire strategy. Can we look at paragraph 4.7 of your witness statement? So this is at EXO 401621 at page 9. And this was with reference to the first edition of your fire strategy. You said the report was signed as having been reviewed by Mr. Sean McElhaney. It is standard practice within Exova for reports to be peer-reviewed in this way. Mr. McElhaney's role was to review the report against the drawings which had been provided. I would expect him to check that what was set out made sense and there were no clear errors in it. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
What would have been the process if there were clear errors in the report?
He would have told me.
Yeah.
Either verbally or he would have annotated a hard copy of the draft.
And then what you would have
I would then
decided?
have considered those, or maybe discussed them with him, and then altered the report accordingly.
And would that be the same process if someone made amendments to a report?
Not quite. That was a little less formal. I think that we were under some time constraints to get the report issued, as we frequently are, and so at the time I was content for Tony Pearson to make any changes he saw fit.
Yeah. Can we look at paragraph 3.8 of Ms Cooney's witness statement? That's EXO 401590, page 3. So if we look at paragraph 3.8, in the second sentence, she says the peer review process at Exova is part of the document quality control and typically involves someone of equal or greater seniority to the drafter reviewing the report to ensure that there are no clear errors and that it is sound in its basis. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Do you agree that the reviewer ought to be someone of equal or greater seniority than the drafter?
Yes, I do agree.
Now, with your reports on the Grenfell project, we know Mr. McElhaney was junior to you. You confirmed that earlier.
Yes.
And Mr. Pearson, was he a junior to you as well?
He was, yes. But in the case of Mr. Pearson, he was suitably qualified to review a report that I prepared.
So why were the reports on this project being checked by someone more junior to you?
It was short. I'm assuming it was just down to availability of somebody to do the review. Bearing in mind that we're not sitting at a desk all day long every day. We're out at meetings with other clients. People are on holiday, etc.
Yeah. Is that normal practice within Exova that reports are actually checked by someone junior to the?
No, I wouldn't have said it was normal practice, but it does happen because of staffing resources.
So on this job, is your explanation that the reason it happened was because of staffing issues on this project?
No, I didn't. No, I think that, as I say, one of the reports was reviewed by Tony Pearson, who was adequately qualified to review a report of that nature. I don't believe that Sean McElhaney was an inadequate person technically to review the report, considering what the content of the report was.
Was the Grenfell project a lower priority for Exova than other projects going on at the time?
No. I mean, if you're in an office with 4 people and 2 of them are out and not available or on holiday or whatever, and you're left with one other person, you would generally ask that person to review the report if you can't get it reviewed by somebody of a comparable grade, if I can call it that, in another office.
Isn't one answer to that to prepare the report sufficiently in advance so that you can always make sure you find a senior person?
Yes, that's fair comment.
Does that mean that often within Exova you were providing reports quite close to the deadline when they were needed?
I would, in my case, yes. I'm not saying that's a generally true of Exova.
I also want to ask you why the practice of reviewing these fire strategy reports seems to differ as between different Exova employees. So I'm going to try and summarise for you what everyone said. James Lee says the process of reviewing was to check whether it was accurate and reasonable. Mr. McElhaney says it was proofreading and checking for clear mistakes. Claire Barker said it was reviewing the report alongside the drawings considered in order to produce that report, looking at the relevant guidance referred to in the report in order to ensure that the report was correct. And then Dr. Pearson gives the most detailed explanation. Perhaps we could go to his statement. This is at EXO 401753, page 3. This is at paragraph 3.9. He says there, the process of peer reviewing a report involves comparing what's written in the report with any floor plans provided and ensuring, 1, that the report is factually correct, 2, that it correlates with the plans, 3, that the approach taken is appropriate, e.g. that the design is based on the appropriate design codes or any fire engineering analyses are based on sound principles, 4, that it is correct where the report says that there's compliance with the cited design codes, and 5, that the facts, logics and mathematics of any fire engineering analyses are correct. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
Can you explain why we have so many different versions of what the process of reviewing a fire strategy report actually involved?
I think probably because each of the individuals concerned was asked to put it in their own words. I don't know that for a fact, but clearly the textbook, the Tony Pearson definition is a textbook.
Would you accept that there was variation within Exova as to how people did review these fire strategy reports?
I think that's inevitable, although they should follow the basic rules are that the report makes sense, that the first 3 at least of what is in Tony Pearson's statement.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. McElhaney said it's about proofreading and checking for clear mistakes. That's very different to what's described here by Mr.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Dr. Pearson.
And that may be Sean's perception.
Just thinking back to Dr. Pearson's amendment, which he made to issue 2, which we looked at, where he drew attention to the non-compliance of the escape route with ADB, would you usually expect to discuss such amendments before anything was issued to the client?
Yes, that would be the normal procedure. If changes were required, the reviewer would talk to the person who prepared the report to agree a way forward.
Now, in the specific instance we're referring to, you didn't discuss any such issues with him, did you, before?
No, it would be evident from the correspondence that we were under some time pressure to get the report issued. So I felt sufficiently confident that what he would do, if he needed to do anything, would be adequate for the purpose.
I see. Yes, you sent an email to Margaret Trenor saying, please get Tony to review the attached, then format it and send it to Bruce at Studio E. So you were happy for him to review it and then for it to be sent straight out.
Indeed.
And you actually said to Tony Pearson, I told Mags to send the report out without reading what you'd added. Do you see that?
Because the most important thing at that juncture was to get the report sent out. I mean, at the end of the day, that particular instance you're quoting wasn't significant. It was just a different way of wording something.
Can I ask now about quality control of emails and thinking in particular about technical emails? If we go within, staying within Dr. Pearson's witness statement and looking at page 3, paragraph 3.7, sorry, that's further up this page at 3.7. And if we pick it up 4 lines down, he says there, as a general rule at Exova, technical advice would not be sent to external clients without 2 people considering the advice. It was therefore not uncommon for Mr. Ashton to discuss technical queries with me or other senior consultants. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
And just to see the complete picture in terms of what he says, if we go on page 6 at paragraph 4.5, and this is with reference to an email that we're going to come back to and look at, 3 lines from the bottom, he says, it was not uncommon for Mr. Ashton to discuss technical matters with other staff, as all email containing technical information had to be approved by at least 2 people, and this might explain my involvement. Do you see that there?
Yes. I mean, I think what he said is substantially correct.
So do you agree with Dr. Pearson's statement about the approval of emails containing technical information?
Well, emails giving a technical opinion are in many ways as important as reports. They do need to be sound when they're given, and therefore we generally look to our colleagues to confirm that what we're saying makes sense.
And can you help us as to what you would have understood technical advice or technical information to cover in such email advice? Can you just help us as to what you would imagine that would cover?
Well, we talked earlier about an email I received from Studio E about cavity barriers.
Yeah.
That would be a technical question to which I gave a technical response.
And did somebody check that, a second person check that before you responded on that
I didn't
occasion?
consider it to be necessary because it was a fairly simple question.
I see. So in terms of your own practice, is it fair to say that not every email you would send containing technical information would have a second person review it before it went out.
That might be true because of the sheer number of emails that we dealt with, but if there was something which I felt I needed a second opinion on, I would definitely get a second opinion.
Do you know where this checking of technical advice was explained in Exova's written quality control procedures?
I don't think it's specifically mentioned as emails, but I've always understood that anything that goes out of the office containing a technical opinion needs to be reviewed by somebody else.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to turn now to look at the other work and the ad hoc advice that you gave after issue 3 of the outlined fire safety strategy.
Yeah.
Is it right that after issue 3 was produced on the 7th of November 2013, you had no further meetings with RBKC Building Control to discuss the fire strategy?
I think that's correct, yes.
Just picking up on the contact that you had with John Hoban of RBKC Building Control, did you ever discuss the cladding and whether it complied with the building regulations with Mr. John Hoban or any other RBKC Building Control inspector?
No.
Can we go to look at Mr. Hoban's first witness statement? This is at RBK 3033934 at page 8. And I want to look at paragraph 67. So in that paragraph, he says, I also looked up information on the installation, and he talks about the cladding panels in the next sentence. And then it's this bit I wanted to ask you about. He says, I was also advised that at the initial meeting on site by the specialist consultant that the cladding would comply with the standards set out in approved document B. Do you see that?
I do, yeah.
Now, just to be fair, I think we ought to scroll back to the page previously and just see the question that Mr. Hoban was being asked. So he was asked what advice or information was available and what assessments were made about the components that comprise the exterior of the building, their fire safety, fire resistance and compliance with safety standards. Do you see that in bold at 64?
Indeed, yes.
And this was part of a paragraph where he answered that. So if we go back then to page 8, he says he's advised at the initial meeting on site by the specialist consultant. Does it follow from the fact that you never went to site that it couldn't have been you giving this advice that the cladding would comply with the standards set out in ADB?
Yes, that's correct. By specialist consultant, I would assume that was somebody who was involved with the cladding.
Then can we also look at Mr. Hoban's second witness statement? This is at RBK 3050416 at page 17. And I want to look at 44A. So he's been asked, and this is the question, in paragraph 67, that was what we just looked at, you state that you were advised by the specialist consultant that the cladding would comply with approved document B. And he's asked who was the specialist consultant. And he says it would have been employees from Max Fordham, Exova and Siderise. Do you see that?
Yes, I see that.
Now, what is your response to that? Could it have been you that Mr. Hoban was referring to in his evidence at this point?
No, I think he was mistaken. I can't believe that Max Fordham would have answered questions about cladding. We certainly didn't answer it. We never met John Hoban on site. Siderise, as far as I know, make fire stops and cavity barriers. I don't think they make cladding. So I think, with respect, he's mistaken.
Did you ever advise Mr. Hoban or anybody else from RBKC Building Control that the cladding would comply with the standards set out in approved document B?
No, categorically no.
Now, we looked at it when we started back in this afternoon session, that you'd had a second meeting with RBKC Building Control back on the 17th of September 2013. Is that right?
Yes, probably.
Yeah, let's look at an email that helps with this. So it's EXO 50390.
Right.
This was an email you sent there on the 18th of September, further to yesterday's meeting.
This is the one you showed.
Yeah, exactly.
First thing, yeah.
Now, you're referring in that email to general arrangement drawings and drawings of the mezzanine and walkway. We can see that from the title of from the attachments at the top. Can you see that? It's got Grenfell GL, Grenfell Metz, Grenfell Walkway. Did
Indeed,
you see that?
yes. Yeah.
Can you recall whether there were any discussions at that meeting about the external cladding?
No, there weren't any.
Can you explain why there weren't any at that meeting?
I can't, no, not really. When we had meetings with building control, it was purely to do with getting the means of escape and firefighting access sorted out.
Would it have been normal on a project of this size to have only met with building control 2 times over the length of the project? So that would be November 2012 and September 2013.
No, I would have expected further meetings, and I think our fee proposal included for at least 3 meetings, but I'd have to check that.
And did it ever occur to you to initiate those further meetings to make sure that they happened?
Sorry, it's only necessary to arrange meetings with building control if the architect asks for it.
I see.
Or, in extremity, Max Fordham, if he wanted a meeting with them to discuss mechanical issues or building services issues. I would never initiate a meeting myself. I did the first one because it was easier for me to contact them than it was for Studio E.
Yeah, and you sent them directly your outlined fire safety strategy.
Yeah, that's right.
When you had those 2 meetings with RBKC Building Control, was it in your mind that there would need to be a meeting with them at some point to discuss the external cladding?
Yes, and all other aspects of the fire safety design, not just the ones that we agreed with them. In my mind, the design team wanted to get the internal refurbishment sorted out first. That was their first priority.
And can you explain why you never checked that meeting had occurred? That there'd been a meeting with building control to discuss the cladding?
It's in the same category as why weren't we looking at the external walls? You know, there was never any. We were never asked to.
And it didn't concern you that there hadn't been a meeting with building control to discuss the external wall?
No, I mean, I'm assuming that would have happened at some point in the future, whether we were still involved or whether after the contractor had been appointed, I don't know. Now,
I want to ask you a little bit about the basis upon which you carried on providing advice into 2014 and 2015. We know that after Ryden's appointment in early 2014, you did continue to provide advice, in particular in relation to the upgrade and overhaul of the existing smoke ventilation system and in relation to the rain screen cladding system, and we'll come to this. You dealt with that in September 14 and March 2015. Do you agree?
Yes.
Did you understand that this advice was provided pursuant to Exova's engagement as fire strategy consultants as set out in your fee proposal?
No, I took it to be ad hoc advice that came about because they wanted some information. And this frequently happens with us, with other projects. People, maybe even 2 years after the completion of the work, we'll get a random query from somebody about how things operate, and we generally will give them that advice, and that's how it works. I mean, I would have been, if I was certain that we were no longer employed on this project because Ryden hadn't novated us, I would have been entitled to say, look, you know, we're not really part of the design team anymore.
But you never did say that, did you?
No, I didn't. And, you know, perhaps I should have done. But that doesn't change the fact that we were no longer part of the design team. Once Ryden was appointed, they didn't novate us, and as far as I was concerned, that was the end of it. We were not actually employed by KCTMO. They didn't write to us and say, would you carry on providing advice to Studio E?
But they've accepted your fee proposal, which said at stage F that you would be providing advice as needed to the building contractor. And so why, if you're still client side, I appreciate you haven't been novated, but given your client side, why did you think that your appointment had come to an end?
Well, because they gave the contract to Ryden, and Ryden didn't approach us to ask us if we wanted to work with them.
But isn't it right that it's quite common for, sometimes a fire engineer might get novated over, but isn't it right that sometimes the fire engineer might stay client side and keep advising the client?
Under those circumstances, I would have expected to get a clear instruction from the client that I'm to carry on working for him rather than the contractor. But that does happen, you're quite right, but I would expect to be told in no uncertain terms that I'm still employed doing that. I received nothing from TMO to that effect.
I see. But I think, as you made clear yesterday, you weren't expecting an instruction from the TMO to go to each stage. You were assuming you were going to each stage unless you heard contrary.
No, this is entirely separate issue. This is where they've appointed a contractor who effectively takes over as the person designing and building the building.
But is it right that you never said, well, now there's a contractor that you've appointed, by the way, we regard ourselves as no longer the fire engineers on this project?
I should have said that when they made the first approach, but I didn't.
So on what basis, just to be clear, on what basis did you carry on providing the advice that you did on the project? For example, on the smoke vent system, on the external wall? We'll come to look at that in due course.
I thought it would be helpful. And if it wasn't, if they wanted free advice, we would have given them free advice. Simply because that's the way we operate.
I see. Were you aware that Exova didn't charge separately for this advice, but treated it as covered by the fixed lump sum fee already paid by the TMO for stage D and E?
Yes, I am aware of that.
And do you agree that you continued to provide advice throughout the duration of the project up until March 2016?
No, I wouldn't say we provided continuing advice. That assumes a regular contact with the design team, and it wasn't anything like that. I think there were 2 isolated emails in 2016, which I answered because they sent them in, but I don't think that we had a continuing relationship beyond the initial ad hoc queries that came in.
We've checked, Mr. Ashton, and between the 1st of April 2014 and the 24th of March 2016, which was your last email exchange, you actually were sent or were copied in to approximately 90 emails on the Grenfell project.
90?
Yeah.
But I don't believe that we answered 90 or anything like that.
You may not have answered 90, but
this comes back to this thing about copying people in on emails. That doesn't necessarily imply that they still have an involvement in the project. That 90 emails implies that we would have been working every week on the project, and that certainly isn't true.
Can we look at what you say at paragraph 5.10 of your witness statement? This is at EXO 401621, page 14. So 5.10. So you said in 5.9, so we should actually pick it up at 5.9. This is Exova's involvement after the appointment of Ryden. I was not aware at the time precisely when Ryden took over the site or were formally appointed. I was aware in general terms that Ryden had taken on the overall responsibility for the project. We were not approached by Ryden to provide services to them. This is not an unusual state of affairs. I think you've just explained that to us. And then you say, as a result of this, we were not copied on project correspondence or invited to attend design team meetings or to agree commercial terms for our continued involvement. On occasion, some queries were raised with me from time to time, and I discussed these below, but aside from that, we were no longer involved in the project. Now, in your experience, was that an unusual state of affairs to be being given advice from time to time in response to queries, but otherwise to consider yourselves no longer involved? Was that a normal state of affairs?
As I said earlier, it does happen quite frequently. People will say, you know, some of you might be the manager of the building already occupied. Can you just give me some information as to what this meant in the fire strategy? And I don't think that's unreasonable for them to ask that or for me to answer it. But I'm sort of, I don't think we've seen copies of 90 emails that you've referred to. I mean, we've been through all of the documentation, and 90 emails doesn't ring any bells with me at all. And why would they send them to me?
Well, there's a lot of emails about the smoke control system, for example, that were being...
90?
Not all about the smoke control. There's some on the cladding, there's the smoke control system, there's advice being continued to be provided. Let's move on. Did you ever question why you were being asked so many times to give advice?
I didn't think it was a large number of times, to be honest.
Okay. So did you ever question why you were being asked for advice, but you were not embedded within the design team at this time?
No, I didn't ask that question, no.
Did that ring any alarm bells for you, that you were providing advice, but you weren't looped in to the day-to-day work of the design team? Was that concerning for you?
It wasn't concerning for me in the sense that the questions that were put forward were reasonably straightforward.
Can we go to the minutes from the contractor induction meeting on the 4th of April 2014? This is at ART 402255. And at paragraph 5.3 on page 4. Now, this wasn't a meeting that you were at. It's recorded, 5.3. Exova completed the fire strategy at tender stage. They have not been novated, but SL, and I think that's Simon Lawrence, will contact them with the view of using them going forward. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
Did Simon Lawrence or anyone else at Ryden ever approach you with a view to instructing you on the project?
Never.
Were you surprised that you were not approached to provide advice pursuant to a contract with Ryden during this post-contract phase?
No, because, as I said earlier, once Ryden had been appointed and we had no contact from them, I assumed that was it. That, as I said earlier, that design and build contractors frequently use their own consultants.
I just want to have a look at some of the emails that you sent during the period you were providing some advice on the project.
Yeah.
I want to start with an email of the 25th of October 2013. Can we go to that? That's at SEA 50121. So if we look at this, this is an email from Mr. Soons to John Allen and Paul Hanson of RBKC Building Control, and you are CC'd into that. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
And in the first paragraph, it says, further to our meeting at RBKC on the 17th of August, we're now in a position to forward you our proposed fire strategy for Grenfell Tower for comment. Please see attached fire strategy drawing, strategy document from Exova, and a description of the proposed upgrade to the smoke exhaust system. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And we can see from the documents list that is attached below, there's a heading documents attached. It's got various plans, sections. And then it says, the final item on the list, Grenfell Tower OFSS. Do you see that? And
yes.
It's IS2, issue 2. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And then the email concludes with reference to a number of other issues that needed to be discussed. So it says there are a number of other issues in dealing with this refurbishment that need to be discussed, and this is probably best done in person once you've had a chance to study the documents? Would you be able to advise on availability, etc., etc.? Now, the email refers to a meeting of the 17th of August 2013. Do you recall attending that meeting?
No, I don't recall, but I'm sure I did, they said I did.
When you were copied into this email, do you recall knowing what the other issues were that needed to be discussed, that are being referred to at the end by Mr. Soons?
No.
Do you know now what he might have been referring to there?
No, not even now.
Now, there was a response from Building Control copying you in on the 11th of November 2013. If we can go to that, that's at RBK 402985. This is a response from John Allen of RBKC Building Control.
Yeah.
And we can see from the first sentence of that Building Control was saying that the information submitted so far was not adequate to enable an effective consultation with the fire authority. Do you see that there?
Yes, indeed.
And it seems clear from the rest of the email that the concerns focused around the smoke control system.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yep.
Is that your understanding?
That is
at the
my
time?
understanding,
Yeah.
yes.
And the email suggests in the fourth paragraph that a letter should be written. It says a letter needs to be written that can be forwarded to the fire authority that presents information on the existing smoke extract system, design and performance, and the proposed replacement system. To your knowledge, was that letter ever written?
I've no idea. As it was Max Fordham's responsibility, I'm not sure whether it went or not.
I see. So you don't know what happened about
No.
addressing it in a letter?
No.
Did you understand at the time you saw this what it was that was inadequate in the information that had been provided at the time?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Did you understand what it was that was inadequate in the information that had been provided at this time?
I read that to mean that they were not satisfied that we'd put forward a smoke ventilation strategy which they could reasonably send to the fire brigade for comment.
Can we go to paragraph 5.3 of your witness statement? This is at EXO 401621, page 12. And you're dealing with this email there. You say on the 11th of November 2013, John Allen of RBKC emailed Mr. Soons, copying me, stating that RBKC did not think that the information submitted so far was adequate to enable an effective consultation with the fire authority. The email stated that the question that needs to be proposed to the brigade is whether the replacement smoke extract system to the residential parts will be acceptable. I do not know what was sent to RBKC prior to this email. The points in the email relate to Max Fordham's work in designing the smoke extract ventilation system, not to Exova's work. Do you see that there?
Yes, I do.
But we saw from the email, and we specifically looked at it a moment ago, that what had been sent to RBKC, to which you were copied in, was issue 2 of your outline fire safety strategy.
Yes, but I don't think that relates to John Allen's concerns. John Allen's concerns were specifically related to the smoke extract system.
Yes, but part of the information they'd received, which they obviously didn't find adequate, was your outline fire safety strategy.
I'm sorry, you're inferring that was the case. I didn't read it that way at all. I didn't think that our report, that ever said to us that our report was inadequate.
I see.
The concern they specifically had was they couldn't send it to the brigade without answering specific questions on the performance of the smoke extract system.
Were you at all concerned at this stage that you hadn't given sufficient advice to enable an effective consultation with the fire authority?
No, I wasn't.
Did you notice that only issue 2 of your outline fire safety strategy had been provided to RBKC Building Control?
I did note that, but as we've already established, there was not an awful lot of difference between 2 and 3. 2 still contained the fundamental proposals in relation to the internal alterations.
Did you ever think about sending them issue 3? So
Not
that
at-
they
not at
had the
that
most
point.
recent
No,
version?
not at that point.
And did you ever do a response to RBKC's email?
No, it wasn't addressed to me specifically. It was addressed to Bruce Soanes, I think. Or certainly Studio E.
Perhaps I can just, Mr. Chairman, I'd quite like to just finish this small topic. It's just a page and a bit of notes, if I can be allowed.
5 minutes.
That would be great. So if we go to EXO 50653, this is an email dated the 15th. Sorry, if we could just... Sorry, I want to look at the one at the bottom of page 1. Yes, that's it. Sorry. It's 15th of January. It's from you to... Is it Duncan Campbell at Max Fordham and Philip Booth? Do you see that there?
Yes, I do, yes.
And it's the subject is lobby smoke venting. So this is a few months on from the correspondence we were just looking at. We can read that. So Duncan, you say it would be possible to carry out a CFD analysis which compared a base case, a code compliance scheme with an automatic opening vent 1.5 metre squared in area located on one side of the lift lobby with what we are proposing, but we haven't budgeted for this analysis and the costs might be more than measuring the flow rates provided by the existing system. Given what we are proposing is a significant improvement over what exists, I think I should say RBKC are being unreasonable. Can we go over? However, we still need to satisfy ourselves that the LFEPA won't reject the system under the RRO. Therefore, it is imperative that RBKC consults the latter for review. Should we, collectively, have another go at RBKC? Kind regards, Terry. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
So it does appear from that email that you are seeing yourself as part of the team that is trying to persuade RBKC that this smoke control proposal is acceptable. Is that not a fair reading of that?
I think to just ignore all of these emails would not have been very helpful to the design team.
Is it right that you're encouraging the design team to have another go to ensure that the system is not rejected by the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority?
I think that's correct. That was the correct thing to do. I mean, we had to get a resolution to this.
This situation had been going on over a prolonged period, as we've seen.
Yeah.
You'd been made aware on the 11th of November 2013 that the building control officer felt he'd not been provided with sufficient information to have an effective consultation. Would you agree, I'm going to put this to you, that with hindsight, you should have been focused on ways to improve the system as opposed to trying to get it past the fire authority and RBKC building control?
No, I think that it was generally accepted, and I've said this several times over the last couple of days, that the natural ventilation system wouldn't work and that it had to be made a mechanical system to have any prospect of improving the situation. The subtle difference between just making it mechanical or doing one which had been verified by a CFD analysis is that RBKC may, in conjunction with the LFB, been prepared to accept something which improved it, but didn't amount to a scheme which meets current standards.
I see.
If that's clear. I mean, there are two ways of doing this. You either put in a code compliance scheme,
Yeah.
and you have to justify that by comparing it to what would have been done naturally, or you say, well, look, we are going to put a fan at the top of the shaft and extract the smoke from there. Will that suffice? That would be a quantum improvement in the arrangements anyway.
Would you agree that you should have been warning the client, the TMO, and or Studio E, that the proposed ventilation system was unsatisfactory?
I think the client already knew that, but as I said earlier, and I don't want to sort of avoid answering your question directly, it was Max Fordham's job to deal with the smoke extract system. We would merely assist them in that process.
Was there a policy within Exova at the time which would have governed the circumstances in which such a warning about the system being unsatisfactory, which would have governed the circumstances in which such a warning should be given? Is there any policy?
Not specifically, no.
Mr. Chairman, that is a really good moment to stop.
Good. Well, you've done well to keep it within 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Right, well, we're going to break at that point, Mr. Ashton, for the afternoon. I'm afraid we are going to have to ask you to come back for a few more questions tomorrow.
Yes, indeed.
But for the time being, you're free to go. Please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're away from the room.
Okay, thank you.
And we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
Right.
Thank you very much. Good, thank you. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.